You know that moment when someone asks a simple question about something you have believed for years, and instead of answering immediately, you feel a strange tension in your chest. Not anger, not certainty, something else. A hesitation. A tiny delay that lasts only a second but feels much longer inside your mind. Most people have experienced that moment. It can happen during a conversation with a friend, while watching a video late at night, while reading a comment online, or even while lying awake in the dark when there is nobody around to hear your thoughts. The question itself is often less disturbing than the reaction it creates, because sometimes the most uncomfortable realization is not that you do not have an answer. It is realizing that you have never allowed yourself to fully examine the question in the first place. Human beings are fascinating in this way. We like to think we build our beliefs through careful reasoning, evidence, and deliberate thought. But when we look honestly at our lives, many of the things we hold most dearly arrived long before we developed the ability to analyze them. We inherited them. We absorbed them. We grew up surrounded by them. They became part of the emotional furniture of our minds. They became familiar. And familiarity has a power that logic often struggles to compete with. Think about how many things feel true simply because they have always been there. The voice of your parents, the customs of your community, the assumptions of your culture, the stories repeated so often that they stopped sounding like stories and started sounding like reality itself. Most people do not wake up one morning and consciously construct their worldview from the ground up. Most people begin with a worldview already installed. Then, over time, they collect evidence that supports it while quietly ignoring evidence that challenges it. Not because they are dishonest, because they are human, because certainty feels safe, because questioning foundational beliefs can feel like questioning your identity. And identity is rarely defended by reason alone. Imagine someone who has spent decades believing something that gives meaning to their suffering, comfort during loss, hope during uncertainty, and a sense of belonging in a confusing world. Now imagine a question appearing that threatens to shake that foundation. What happens next? Many people assume logic enters the room and calmly evaluates the evidence. But psychology tells a more complicated story. The mind often begins defending itself before it begins investigating. Emotional attachment arrives before analysis. Protective instincts activate before rational examination. The conclusion is often chosen first. The reasoning comes later. This is not unique to any religion, ideology, philosophy, or worldview. It is a deeply human pattern. We are storytellers trying to preserve coherence in the narrative of our lives. We want the world to make sense. We want our sacrifices to matter. We want our suffering to have purpose. We want our choices to feel justified. And whenever those desires become connected to a belief, separating emotion from evaluation becomes extraordinarily difficult. That is why some questions feel dangerous even when nobody is threatening us. A question can challenge more than an idea. It can challenge a relationship, a community, a sense of meaning, a vision of the future. It can threaten emotional stability. And when that happens, logic is no longer entering a neutral environment. It is entering a battlefield already occupied by fear, hope, loyalty, memory, and identity. Consider how often people demand evidence when confronting ideas they dislike, but lower the standard when evaluating ideas they already accept. The same person can become fiercely skeptical in one conversation and remarkably trusting in another. Not because intelligence disappeared, because motivation changed. The mind is not always searching for truth. Sometimes it is searching for reassurance. Sometimes it is searching for confirmation. Sometimes it is searching for emotional survival. And that realization is deeply uncomfortable because it forces us to ask a question many people spend their entire lives avoiding. If I had been born somewhere else, surrounded by different influences, taught different assumptions, exposed to different traditions, would I still believe exactly what I believe today? Most people answer that question emotionally before they answer it honestly, because the implications are unsettling. They suggest that certainty may not be as independent as we imagine. They suggest that circumstance plays a larger role in belief than many of us want to admit. And once that possibility enters the room, another question follows closely behind. How much of what I call conviction is actually familiarity? How much of what I call certainty is actually repetition? How much of what I call truth feels true because it has been reinforced thousands of times? These questions do not provide easy answers. They create tension, they create doubt, and doubt is one of the most misunderstood experiences in human life. Many people treat doubt as an enemy, yet doubt is often the birthplace of genuine understanding. Certainty requires very little effort when inherited. Understanding requires examination. Understanding requires wrestling with contradictions, uncertainties, unanswered questions, and uncomfortable possibilities. Understanding demands courage because it risks discovering that reality is more complicated than the stories we prefer. There is a reason why moments of deep reflection often feel lonely. They remove the protective noise of crowds. They force us into direct contact with ourselves. In those moments, it becomes harder to rely on slogans, traditions, or familiar phrases. The mind begins asking deeper questions. Why do I believe this? What would change my mind? Have I ever seriously examined the strongest arguments against my position? Am I protecting truth or protecting comfort? These are not easy questions because they do not merely evaluate beliefs. They evaluate honesty. And honesty is expensive. Real honesty sometimes requires admitting uncertainty where certainty once existed. It sometimes requires acknowledging emotional influences we would rather ignore. It sometimes requires recognizing that intelligence does not make us immune to self-deception. In fact, intelligence can occasionally make self-deception more sophisticated. A clever mind can become exceptionally skilled at defending conclusions it never genuinely questioned. It can build elaborate arguments around emotional commitments. It can confuse explanation with proof. It can mistake confidence for correctness. And perhaps that is why some of the most profound moments in life do not occur when we find answers. They occur when we discover questions we can no longer dismiss, questions that follow us into quiet rooms, questions that appear during sleepless nights, questions that linger beneath ordinary conversations, questions that reveal the difference between what we truly know and what we merely assume. The uncomfortable truth is that many people are far more familiar with defending their beliefs than examining them. They have rehearsed responses but not investigations. They have memorized conclusions but not explored alternatives. And when logic finally arrives, it does not always destroy belief. Sometimes it strengthens it. Sometimes it refines it. Sometimes it exposes weaknesses. Sometimes it reveals hidden assumptions. But whatever happens, the process is rarely painless, because logic is not merely a tool for proving others wrong. It is a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous because they show us things we would rather not see. They reveal contradictions. They expose blind spots. They highlight inconsistencies between what we claim and what we actually do. They force us to confront the possibility that we are not as objective as we imagine. Most people fear being wrong about specific ideas. But there is something even more unsettling. Realizing how easy it is to feel certain while being mistaken. Realizing that confidence and truth are not the same thing. Realizing that sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. Realizing that entire groups of intelligent people can reach radically different conclusions while feeling equally convinced. Once you see that reality clearly, a new level of humility becomes necessary, because suddenly the world appears far more complex than before. The simple narratives begin to crack. The easy divisions between believers and skeptics, certainty and doubt, logic and emotion, start to dissolve. You begin noticing that everyone is wrestling with uncertainty, whether they admit it or not. Everyone is trying to construct meaning in a universe that often refuses to provide simple answers. Everyone is navigating fears they rarely discuss openly. Everyone is searching for stability in a reality filled with unanswered questions. And perhaps the most uncomfortable realization of all is that logic alone does not automatically solve this struggle. Logic can identify contradictions. Logic can expose weak arguments. Logic can clarify thinking. But logic cannot remove the human desire for meaning, belonging, hope, purpose, love, and significance. Those needs remain. The challenge is learning how to examine our beliefs honestly without losing our humanity in the process. The challenge is learning how to question deeply without becoming cynical. The challenge is learning how to seek truth without becoming addicted to certainty. Because the real danger may not be doubt. The real danger may be the illusion that we have nothing left to question. Picture yourself sitting alone after everyone has gone to sleep. The house is silent. The notifications have stopped. There is no audience, no debate, no need to defend yourself, no social pressure pushing you toward one answer or another. It is just you and your thoughts. Those moments are rare because most people spend their lives surrounded by noise. Noise is comforting. Noise prevents certain questions from becoming loud enough to hear. But eventually there comes a night when distraction fails. A night when a thought appears that refuses to leave. A night when certainty feels strangely fragile, not shattered, not destroyed, just thinner than it used to be. And that feeling alone can be terrifying, because many people are not afraid of being wrong. They are afraid of what happens after being wrong. They are afraid of the emptiness they imagine will replace the structure they have relied upon for years. Human beings do not merely hold beliefs. They live inside them. Beliefs shape relationships, decisions, sacrifices, identities, ambitions, fears, and hopes. They influence who we trust, what we value, how we interpret suffering, and how we understand ourselves. That is why questioning a deeply rooted belief often feels less like changing an opinion and more like renovating the foundation of a house while still living inside it. Every movement creates anxiety. Every crack feels dangerous. Every uncertainty seems amplified. Yet something fascinating happens when people begin examining their beliefs honestly. They often discover that the strongest resistance does not come from evidence. It comes from emotion. Not because emotions are bad, emotions are unavoidable. They are part of being human. But emotions can quietly influence conclusions, while convincing us we are being purely rational. Imagine two people examining the exact same information. One sees validation, the other sees contradiction. One feels reassured, the other feels disturbed. The information itself has not changed. What changed is the emotional framework through which it is interpreted. This reality extends far beyond religion, philosophy, or ideology. It affects politics, relationships, careers, self-image, and nearly every aspect of human existence. People often believe they are evaluating reality directly when they are actually evaluating reality through a network of emotional filters. Those filters are invisible precisely because they feel natural. They feel like common sense, they feel like obvious truth. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates how often entire populations can accept assumptions that later generations find difficult to understand. The people living inside those assumptions rarely notice them. That is the power of collective belief. When enough people share an idea, the idea begins to feel self-evident. It stops appearing as one possibility among many and starts appearing as reality itself. This creates an uncomfortable challenge. How do you distinguish between something that is true and something that merely feels true because it has been reinforced throughout your life? There is no simple formula. There is no magical test that instantly separates certainty from illusion. That is precisely what makes the process so unsettling. Genuine reflection requires sitting with uncertainty longer than most people prefer. It requires resisting the urge to rush toward immediate conclusions. It requires tolerating ambiguity, and ambiguity is emotionally exhausting. The mind craves closure. It wants the story finished. It wants a clear answer. It wants the tension resolved. But some questions refuse to cooperate. Some questions expose the limits of human understanding itself. And when that happens, many people become desperate for certainty, even if the certainty is artificial. They would rather possess a simple answer than confront a complicated reality. This tendency is understandable. Uncertainty feels vulnerable. It creates psychological discomfort. It reminds us how little control we truly possess. Yet there is a strange paradox hidden inside that discomfort. The people most committed to certainty are often the people least prepared for reality when reality becomes complicated. Life rarely behaves according to clean narratives. Good people suffer. Careful plans fail. Unexpected opportunities appear. Tragedies arrive without warning. Questions emerge without answers. Human existence is filled with contradictions that resist easy explanations. And whenever reality collides with a simplified worldview, Tension emerges. Some people respond by questioning their assumptions. Others respond by protecting them at all costs. That distinction reveals something important about the psychology of belief. For many individuals, a belief is not merely a conclusion. It is a psychological shelter. It provides order amid chaos. It transforms uncertainty into certainty. It reduces complexity into manageable narratives. And while shelters can provide safety, they can also limit exploration. At some point, every person faces a decision. Do I value comfort more than investigation? Do I prefer reassurance or understanding? Am I willing to follow a question wherever it leads, even if the destination feels uncomfortable? These are not intellectual questions alone. They are emotional questions, moral questions, personal questions. Because the search for truth often demands sacrifices that people rarely discuss openly. Sometimes it requires admitting ignorance. Sometimes it requires disappointing expectations. Sometimes it requires standing apart from a group. Sometimes it requires accepting that certain mysteries may remain unresolved. And perhaps that is what makes honest inquiry so rare. It is not because people lack intelligence. It is because honesty can be expensive. Imagine realizing that a position you defended passionately for years contains weaknesses you never noticed. Imagine discovering that an argument you dismissed too quickly deserves more attention than you gave it. Imagine recognizing that some of your strongest convictions are supported less by evidence than by emotional attachment. None of these realizations feel pleasant. They challenge pride. They challenge identity. They challenge the image we have constructed of ourselves as rational and objective individuals. Yet growth often begins precisely where comfort ends. Consider how different genuine curiosity feels compared to defensive certainty. Curiosity asks, what if I am missing something? Defensive certainty asks, how can I prove I am right? Curiosity seeks understanding. Defensive certainty seeks validation. Curiosity explores. Defensive certainty protects. And while protection has its place, a life built entirely around protection eventually becomes intellectually fragile. Anything that threatens the existing structure becomes dangerous. Questions become enemies. Doubt becomes a threat. Alternative perspectives become intolerable. The individual gradually becomes trapped inside a shrinking world where certainty must constantly be defended because it cannot withstand examination. Ironically, beliefs that survive scrutiny often emerge stronger than beliefs that avoid it. A conviction tested by difficult questions possesses a different quality than a conviction inherited without examination. One has encountered resistance, the other has merely enjoyed agreement. This distinction matters because many people confuse exposure with understanding. They assume that hearing a belief repeatedly means they have investigated it deeply. But repetition is not investigation. Familiarity is not understanding. Confidence is not proof. The most challenging moments of self-reflection occur when we begin separating those concepts, when we recognize how much of our mental world is built from assumptions we rarely inspect, when we notice how often emotional comfort influences intellectual conclusions, when we confront the possibility that we have been answering certain questions long before we truly understood them. None of this means every belief collapses under examination, nor does it mean every question has an answer. The deeper lesson is something more subtle. It is the recognition that intellectual humility may be one of the most difficult virtues a human being can develop. Humility requires acknowledging that reality is under no obligation to conform to our preferences. It requires accepting that sincere people can disagree. It requires recognizing that confidence can coexist with error. It requires admitting that the human mind, remarkable as it is, remains vulnerable to bias, fear, wishful thinking, and self-deception. That realization can feel unsettling because it removes the illusion of complete certainty. Yet it also creates an opportunity. Once you stop pretending to know more than you do, curiosity becomes possible again. Wonder becomes possible again. Genuine exploration becomes possible again. Instead of defending conclusions automatically, you begin investigating them. Instead of fearing questions, you become interested in them. Instead of treating uncertainty as weakness, You recognize it as an inevitable part of being human. And perhaps that is where the most meaningful transformation begins. Not in abandoning every belief, not in accepting every challenge, not in reaching some final answer that eliminates all doubt forever, but in developing the courage to examine the foundations beneath your convictions honestly, to ask difficult questions without panic, to encounter unfamiliar perspectives without hostility, to recognize that the search for understanding is often more valuable than the illusion of certainty. Because beneath every argument, beneath every worldview, beneath every debate about truth, there remains a deeper question that concerns every human being. Are you seeking reality as it is, or are you seeking a version of reality that makes you feel safe? The answer to that question is rarely obvious. It hides beneath emotions, memories, fears, hopes, and identities accumulated over a lifetime. Finding it requires patience, it requires courage, and most of all, it requires a willingness to face yourself without the protection of easy answers. The strangest part of all this is that most people assume the greatest threat to their beliefs comes from powerful arguments, brilliant thinkers, difficult books, or relentless critics. But often, the most significant challenge arrives in a much quieter form. It arrives as a moment of honesty, a moment when you stop performing for other people, a moment when you stop defending your position long enough to examine it, a moment when you ask yourself a question you have carefully avoided for years. What if the real battle has never been between faith and logic, certainty and doubt, belief and skepticism? What if the real battle has always been between comfort and honesty? Because comfort is seductive. Comfort asks very little from us. It rewards familiarity. It encourages repetition. It assures us that everything important has already been settled. It promises relief from uncertainty. And in a world overflowing with complexity, that promise can feel irresistible. Yet honesty operates differently. Honesty demands investigation. Honesty refuses to grant special protection to cherished assumptions. Honesty does not care how long a belief has existed, how popular it is, how emotionally satisfying it feels, or how deeply it is woven into personal identity. Honesty simply asks whether a belief can withstand examination. That question sounds simple until it becomes personal. Then everything changes, because suddenly the discussion is no longer about abstract ideas. It becomes about you, about the stories that shaped your life, about the assumptions that guided your decisions, about the fears you rarely acknowledge and the hopes you rarely question. Every human being carries a private narrative explaining who they are and how the world works. That narrative provides direction. It creates coherence. It transforms scattered experiences into something resembling meaning. The problem is that narratives can become so familiar that we stop distinguishing between the story and reality. We begin assuming that our interpretation of events is the only reasonable interpretation. We stop noticing alternative possibilities. We stop asking difficult questions, and over time, certainty becomes less a conclusion and more a habit. Habits are powerful precisely because they operate automatically. You no longer think about them. You simply live inside them. Imagine spending years walking through the same neighborhood every day. Eventually, you stop noticing details. The streets become invisible through familiarity. The same thing happens with ideas. Repeated assumptions gradually disappear into the background of consciousness. They become mental scenery. They feel so obvious that questioning them seems unnecessary. Then one day, something disrupts the routine. A conversation, a contradiction, a personal crisis, a moment of unexpected reflection. Suddenly, the familiar landscape looks different. Questions appear where certainty once stood. Ambiguity enters places that once felt settled. The experience can feel deeply unsettling because the mind instinctively seeks stability. Human beings crave psychological ground beneath their feet. We want to know where we stand. We want clear answers. We want dependable frameworks. Yet reality often refuses to cooperate. Reality is messy. Reality contains paradoxes. Reality includes mysteries that remain unresolved despite centuries of debate. And perhaps one of the hardest truths to accept is that intelligence does not eliminate uncertainty. In many cases, it increases awareness of uncertainty. The more deeply someone investigates complicated questions, the more they discover layers they had never considered before. The world becomes larger. The unknown becomes more visible. Certainty becomes harder to maintain. This is why intellectual humility is so often mistaken for weakness. From the outside, certainty appears strong. Doubt appears fragile. Yet genuine humility may require more courage than certainty ever demands. Certainty can hide behind conclusions. Humility remains exposed to questions. Certainty often seeks protection. Humility remains open to revision. Certainty can create psychological comfort. Humility accepts discomfort as part of the search for understanding. None of this means people should abandon conviction. Convictions matter, values matter, commitments matter. The issue is not whether you possess beliefs. The issue is how you relate to them. Do your beliefs serve as tools for exploring reality, or have they become barriers preventing exploration? Are they foundations that support growth, or walls that prevent investigation? The distinction matters because human beings possess an extraordinary ability to protect themselves from information they do not want to confront. We reinterpret evidence. We minimize contradictions. We exaggerate supportive details. We dismiss inconvenient perspectives. We selectively remember experiences that reinforce existing assumptions. These tendencies are not signs of moral failure. They are part of ordinary psychology. Yet recognizing them changes everything. Once you understand how easily the mind can deceive itself, self-examination becomes essential. Suddenly, the goal is no longer winning arguments. The goal becomes understanding yourself. Why does a particular question make you uncomfortable? Why does a specific challenge feel threatening? Why do certain ideas provoke immediate defensiveness while others do not? These questions often reveal more than the original debate ever could, because beneath every intellectual disagreement lies an emotional landscape. Fear of being wrong, fear of losing meaning, fear of isolation, fear of uncertainty, fear of disappointing people we care about, fear of facing a reality that looks different from the one we expected. These fears influence thinking far more than most individuals realize, yet they remain largely invisible because they disguise themselves as certainty. The person convinced they are defending truth may actually be defending security. The person insisting they are following evidence may unknowingly be following emotional attachment. The person dismissing questions may not be protecting knowledge but protecting stability. Recognizing this possibility does not automatically invalidate beliefs. It simply introduces a level of self-awareness that many people never reach. It forces a deeper examination of motivation. It asks not only what do I believe, but why do I believe it? That second question is far more difficult because it moves beyond conclusions into the hidden machinery that produces them. And once that process begins, something unexpected often happens. The world becomes more complicated, but also more interesting. Certainty may decrease, yet understanding grows. Simple narratives lose their appeal because reality reveals greater depth than simplistic explanations can capture. You begin noticing how frequently human beings construct meaning from limited information. You begin seeing how often confidence exceeds evidence. You begin recognizing the universal struggle to balance reason, emotion, identity, and uncertainty. Most importantly, you begin seeing that this struggle is shared by everyone. The believer wrestles with uncertainty. The skeptic wrestles with uncertainty. The philosopher wrestles with uncertainty. The scientist wrestles with uncertainty. The critic wrestles with uncertainty. The difference is rarely whether uncertainty exists. The difference is how individuals respond to it. Some run from it. Some deny it. Some hide behind certainty. Some become paralyzed by doubt. Others learn to live with it. They accept that not every question will be answered. They accept that understanding is often incomplete. They accept that being human means navigating mysteries larger than themselves. There is a quiet strength in that acceptance. It does not provide easy comfort. It does not eliminate tension. It does not solve every philosophical problem. But it creates something perhaps more valuable than certainty. It creates honesty. Honest recognition of limitations. Honest recognition of complexity. honest recognition of the fact that reality may be larger than any single worldview can fully capture. And perhaps that is the ultimate challenge hidden beneath every difficult question, not whether a belief survives logic, not whether doubt defeats certainty, not whether one worldview triumphs over another. The deeper challenge is whether you possess the courage to look directly at your own mind, to examine the fears that shape your conclusions, to question the assumptions that feel untouchable, to recognize the difference between what you know, what you suspect, what you hope, and what you simply inherited. Because in the end, the most uncomfortable truths are rarely found in arguments. They are found in self-reflection. They emerge when the noise fades and you are left alone with your thoughts. They appear when you stop asking whether other people are mistaken and start asking whether you might be missing something yourself. And that possibility, more than any debate, more than any criticism, more than any challenge from the outside world, may be the one thing capable of transforming how you see everything. The question is not whether you will encounter uncertainty. You already have. The question is what you will do when it arrives. Will you retreat into familiar answers, or will you allow the discomfort to teach you something about yourself? That decision belongs to every person. It cannot be outsourced, it cannot be inherited, it cannot be made by a crowd. It happens quietly, internally, in moments that nobody else sees, and perhaps those moments, more than any certainty we ever claim to possess, reveal who we truly are.